Before we begin, take a deep breath and let the noise of the day slowly fade. Unclench your jaw, soften your eyes, and let the weight of modern life melt away. Tonight, we're not chasing action or drama. We're wandering into the forgotten corridors of boring history, where medieval echoes linger and dark tales unfold like fading ink on parchment. Welcome to Midnight Sleepless, a resting place for tired minds, where the Middle Ages, ancient empires, and strange, dark history. Stories drift by like soft clouds. Here, knights, castles, and quiet empires return not with a roar, but with a whisper. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Okay, if you enjoyed these slow, sleepy journeys through medieval times, boring facts, and forgotten worlds, a gentle tap on the subscribe button helps keep this calm storytelling alive. Now, let the story begin. A thin veil of mist hovered over the fjord lands at dawn, curling in ghostly ribbons between jagged cliffs and the quiet black water below. The sea smelled of ancient brine and mystery, as if the ocean had whispered secrets all night into the hollows of seashells. In this sharp-edged world carved by glaciers, men and women had learned to survive not only by skill, but by ritual, patience, and ancestral cunning at the heart of a small coastal village called Narvik, where turf-roofed huts clung to the crags like stubborn barnacles. Young Ingrid Schidelstad stood beside the smokehouse, rubbing her arms against the early chill. She was 17, lean and sharp-featured, with wind-burned cheeks and bright blue eyes that seemed to absorb storm and starlight alike. At her feet lay tightly woven baskets packed with this morning's silver catch cod, herring, and mackerel glinting faintly in the ashen light. Her grandmother, Fru Ice, emerged moments later from their Longhouse. Stoop-shouldered but fierce-eyed, her gray braid tied neatly with twine. She carried a sack of coarse sea salt, drawn from the shallows the week before. Without speaking, she handed Ingrid a basin filled with brine so strong that knots of seaweed still floated at the top like drowned snakes. "Quickly now," Ike muttered, "before the sun warms their flesh." Ingrid nodded and knelt beside the baskets, the careful rhythm long drilled into her by seasons of practice. She gutted each fish behind the gills, scooping out entrails and smoothing away blood with handfuls of icy seawater fetched from a nearby tide pool. Once cleaned, the fish were plunged into brining tubs. They would stay submerged just long enough to drink in the salt, but not so long as to become tough. The village elders said timing was everything. 1 hour too short meant rot, 1 hour too long meant leather. And so Ingrid watched the sky, not clocks, letting the changing hues speak to her internal sense of time. Beyond her, the fjord stirred awake. Longboats bobbed lazily on their tethers. Farther out, foam-flecked waves slapped the barnacled hulls of trading ships waiting for tides favorable enough to slip through narrow blue channels toward Bergen. It was not only fish preserved here in Narvik, but power, pride, and rumors. Some claimed the fjord was bottomless, a tear in the earth's crust where gods once battled sea serpents. Others whispered of hidden Viking hordes and iron-bound chests somewhere beneath the dark water. As a child, Ingrid had listened wide-eyed to bedtime tales of silver bracelets, runic swords, and the drowned spirits that guarded them. Her grandmother believed that every family in Narvik kept only more than fish in their smokehouses. They kept stories, alliances, rivalries, and that the lingering curls of smoke rising from every roof were just another kind of language. Once the fish had soaked long enough, they were pulled from the brine, pale and firm with salt. Ingrid laid them along spruce racks to drip, while her grandmother tended the smokehouse fire, feeding it slowly with alder wood chips and dried juniper. The smoke that rose was earthy, sharp, and sweet all at once. The scent of it drifted across the village like a summons. Soon, neighbors began to emerge, trudging over with their own buckets and baskets, at the smokehouse doorway. The women arranged strings of fish from iron hooks, scaling upward in orderly rows. The fattest herring dangled proudly in the center, like offerings to old gods. Children were sent to gather peat moss and lingonberry branches. The combination of these materials provided both flavor and preservation magic, or so eyes claimed. Ingrid often wondered if the magic was real. She had watched as storms shattered boats against hidden rocks, as sickness took strong men like lightning-struck trees, and as newborns arrived, gazing up at the world as if they had seen it before. Why wouldn't magic curl in the smoke as well? Once everything was hung, Ingrid and Ice retreated from the suffocating smoke, wiping tears from their eyes. Outside, other villagers stood chatting in clumps, their words quiet but edged with curiosity. In Narvik, gossip traveled faster than gulls. Today, the topic was a mysterious visitor, rumored to have arrived last night on a narrow skiff, a merchant, or perhaps a spy. "What do you think he wants?" whispered Ragnhild Halvorsen, a plump, red-haired woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper ears, as she sidled up to Ingrid. "News says he's come looking for coalfish." Ragnhild went on without waiting for a reply. "But what merchant travels alone, with no crates and no offers? I've watched him study the cliffs like a map, not the fish." Ingrid shrugged, though a prickle crawled up her spine. She had seen the man, too tall, gaunt, dark-haired, with a scar that split one eyebrow. He had asked for something curious, not fish, but names. Names of families who lived between certain stones. Names that might lead him to secrets not meant for outsiders. "He's trouble," her grandmother had muttered, spitting into the dirt for protection. "Mark my words." Back inside the smokehouse, the fishes quietly absorbed the swirling smoke. Heat low, patience high. By midnight tonight, their skins would bronze into shades of amber, gold. Deep mahogany, edible treasure meant to keep the village fed through long winters where the sun barely brushed the horizon. By afternoon, Ingrid stole a moment's rest on a rocky outcrop behind their house, overlooking the fjord's quiet expanse. She watched seabirds swoop in erratic patterns above crude wooden jetties. Far below, seals peered like mischievous faces from slick gray stones. Away from the noise, Ingrid could admit what she dared not speak. She felt hemmed in by salt and smoke, bound to rituals she had never chosen. Somewhere beyond the mouth of the fjord lay wider oceans. Tales of scented spice markets, cities whose smoke smelt not of fish, but of cinnamon and silk. She was still daydreaming when the stranger appeared, stepping lightly over rocks, as though they had come to life just for his boots. Ingrid started, heart hammering. "You are Ingrid Schegelstad?" he asked, in a voice low and smooth, tinged with an accent she couldn't place. She swallowed. "Who is asking?" He bowed slightly. "My name is Elias Rundberg. I seek information about a man called Lars Gudmundsson, who once lived near this fjord." Ingrid stiffened. That name had not been spoken openly in years. Lars Gudmundsson had been a fisherman, a thief, and her uncle long vanished after a feud that ended in bloodshed by the water's edge. He had disappeared during a stormy night when lightning shattered the sky and someone's fishing nets had been found cut by a knife. Gossip said he had fled with a chest of gold coins stolen from a Bergen nobleman. Others believed he had drowned, still clutching secrets heavy enough to drag him through the deep. "I know nobody by that name." Ingrid lied quickly. Elias studied her with eyes like flint. "You are as deft with lies as you must be with gutting fish." Anger flared, but before she could respond, footsteps approached. Grandmother stood there, having followed her with the instinct of a wolf protecting its pup. "The girl speaks." "The truth," I said dangerously, though her hands were empty. "Leave." Elias tipped his head, not in respect, but in acknowledgement of an obstacle. "So be it." he said softly. But secrets preserved too long tend to rot from the inside. With that, he vanished back toward the village, as silent as a shadow. That evening, Ingrid and Nice walked to the smokehouse to check the progress of their batch. The warm twilight was streaked with bruised color, red and purple, along the fjord's rim. Beside, the fish hung obediently, gold-skinned now, shimmering faintly like coins. Ingrid had always taken pride in this transformation, how rawness became resilience, how flesh that would spoil within days could be made to last months. But tonight, every crackle of burning juniper sounded like a warning. Hours later, well past midnight, Ingrid awoke to the scent of something wrong. Smoke, yes, but thicker, harsher. She threw on a cloak and burst out of the house. Running toward the smokehouse, panic battering her ribcage, flames licked the edges of the wooden structure. Someone had smashed the shutters and tossed in burning pitch. Already, neighbors were shouting, forming frantic lines with buckets of seawater. Ingrid dropped to her knees beside a tub, scooping and throwing water. Desperately, the smoked fish, her family's entire winter supply, and a vital part of the village's shared stores, crackled in danger of turning to ashes. It took nearly an hour to bring the blaze under control. When they finally opened the blackened door, a wave of scorched smoke rolled out. Inside, the once beautiful fish hung now as shriveled black husks. Ingrid fought back tears of fury and grief. This was not accident, Ice growled. This was warning. Ingrid's thoughts flashed to Elias Rundberg, his strange questions, his scarred face. Had someone sent him not to barter, but to threaten, to uncover some buried crime that still lay like a bone under soft earth? The next morning, while villagers muttered about curses, Ingrid knew she could not simply rebuild and keep salting fish. Something had shifted forever. She walked down to the tide line, shoes crunching on gravel, and stared into the endless water. What good was preservation if the past still rose up to bite? Her grandmother, joined her after a moment, wrapping a shawl tight around her shoulders. "Sometimes," Ice said quietly, "we must let one secret die to save the rest." "What secret?" Ingrid whispered. Ice stared hard at the sea. "The truth that your uncle's chest of gold was never lost up in the mountains, that it rests still below our house, buried beneath the smokehouse stones. That your family's prosperity all these years has come not just from fish, but from keeping a thief's treasure safe. Elias Rundberg belongs to the nobleman who owned those coins he comes to collect." The revelation hit Ingrid like cold water. Everything she had believed and everything she had preserved was layered over hidden rot. She closed her eyes against it. When she opened them again, the horizon seemed to shine sharper, clearer, more dangerous. "What will we do?" she asked. Her grandmother reached out, squeezing her hand. "We do what we have always done, child. We smoke, we salt, we survive." But that day, Ingrid made a vow deep in her heart. She would be the last keeper of this particular secret. She would find a way to rid herself of stolen gold and tangled lies, to preserve not just fish, but family honor. The fjordlands were harsh, their waters deep with mystery. But Ingrid Schulstad, raised on smoke, salt, and secrets, was fiercer still. And as she looked once more toward the open sea, she imagined packing only what she could carry, boarding a trader's vessel bound for places where no one knew her name, beginning anew. For now, though, she turned back toward the smoldering smokehouse, shoulders squared. There were fish to clean, fires to rebuild. Somewhere out there, a storm was surely coming. In the pale light of dawn, before the village cock began to crow, the rhythmic scrape of stone against stone echoed softly across the courtyard. It was a sound older than language itself, song of labor, of hands their ground nourishment. From the earth, Anaya sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor of her family's mud brick home. Hunched over the heavy, chakia circular stone slab used for grinding, a thin film of flour dust already covered her hands, forearms, and the hem of her simple cotton sari. The larger stone slab rested firmly in place, and atop it, she gripped the smaller, sized roller stone, its edges smoothed by decades of use. Between them lay a modest pile of barley, golden and coarse, harvested just weeks ago from the terrace fields on the hillside. The air was still. It's the kind of quiet that belongs only to the earliest hours, when the stars still linger reluctantly above and dew clings to every blade of grass. The house around her slept in gentle hums, her grandmother's slow, steady breaths, her little brother's restless turning, and her father's occasional cough. But in the front room, Anaya was already awake, already working. This was not unusual. She had taken over the morning grinding 2 years ago, when her mother had died unexpectedly after a sudden illness. At first, her hands had ached from the labor, her shoulders stiff from leaning over the stone for too long. The barley would scatter or clump together, and the grinding would be uneven. Her grandmother had watched in silence, correcting her only when necessary. But now the work had become muscle memory. Her palms curved perfectly over the roller stone. The pressure she applied was intuitive, the motion smooth and ceaseless. With each grind, the barley broke down into finer and finer meal, the powder collecting in soft mounds along the rim of the slab. Outside, the first hints of orange were streaking across the horizon. The sun had not yet risen, but the morning was beginning to stir. A few houses away, a cow lowed lazily. A dog barked once, and then fell silent again. Somewhere farther off, the dull thud of a wooden pestle pounding grain in a mortar joined the chorus. Anaya paused to brush sweat from her brow with her shoulder. Her long braid swung forward, brushing the flour-dusted slab. She glanced at the pile of crushed barley. Still not enough. Her grandmother insisted that the morning grind must feed everyone, and there would be guests today. Her uncle and his sons, traveling in from the northern ridge for the village council meeting. She reached into the sack beside her and poured out another handful of barley. It spilled across the stone like tiny golden pebbles, catching the faint light seeping in through the cracks in the mud walls. She resumed the grind, this time leaning a little more into it, her breath steady, her body swaying in quiet rhythm. Grinding was more than a task, it was a ritual. In the old days, her grandmother had told her, women would rise before the gods themselves had woken. The grinding stone was blessed, and the first handful of meal offered to the hearth fire before the rest was used for bread. There was meaning in the motion, power in the rhythm. The friction between stone and grain was a sacred conversation that made raw earth into sustenance. Anaya had begun to understand this in her own way. She found peace in the repetition. It was a place where her thoughts could drift, where memories of her mother's laughter, her father's stories, and the quiet teachings of her grandmother coals and fell like the strokes of her grinding. She thought of the barley itself. It had been planted in the cold weeks when the air stung the skin and the hillsides turned brittle with frost. Her father had carried the sack on his shoulders, her little brother chasing after him with a crooked stick, pretending to be a plowman. Now, that same barley harvested, sun-dried, and winnowed by hand had come full circle. Its journey from field to slab to hearth was almost complete. She smiled to herself. There was a kind of poetry in that. By the time the first rays of sunlight spilled fully into the room, Anaya was nearly done. A fine layer of barley flour dusted the slab. Her arms were sore, and a slight cramp was forming in her shoulder. But she didn't stop. She tapped the roller against the edge of the slab, collecting the loose powder into the center. Then she carefully scooped the flour into a wide wooden bowl, brushing the last bits with the edge of her hand. Her grandmother had woken and now stood at the doorway, watching silently. "You've made enough for breakfast and for the noon meal," the old woman said, her voice hoarse with sleep but steady. Anaya nodded. "There are still some grains left for evening," she added. Her grandmother shuffled forward, placing a warm hand on Anaya's shoulder. "You grind like your mother. Steady, strong. The flour looks light and even." She would have been proud. The words made something warm bloom inside Anaya. She didn't reply. She simply picked up the bowl and carried it toward the hearth, where the fire from last night's coals still smoldered faintly. She fed it a handful of twigs, then a few pieces of dung cake. Hand blew gently until the flame came alive again. Soon, the house was filled with the smell of cooking. Flat cakes of barley dough sizzled on the iron griddle, their edges crisping into golden brown. Steam rose from a bubbling pot of lentils beside it. Her little brother stumbled in, rubbing his eyes, still half asleep, but drawn by the aroma. Naya gave him a teasing smile and handed him the first warm roti, torn in half and drizzled with ghee. He took it without a word, chewing quietly, his eyelids still heavy. By the time the men arrived, her uncle and his two sons, all boisterous and dusty from the road breakfast, was ready. Anaya served them all with a quiet grace, refilling their cups with milk and setting down hot rotis, one after the other. No one spoke of the grinding, but all of them tasted its effort. Later, after the kitchen had been cleaned, the hearth swept, and the last embers left to die, Anaya returned to the grinding stone. It sat silent now, warm in the morning sun that spilled through the open door. "Okay." She wiped it clean with a damp cloth and covered it with a cloth, as her grandmother had taught her. In the hush that followed, she sat beside it for a while, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the slab. Too many, it was just a stone, cold, heavy, unremarkable, but to Anaya, it was something more, a place where generations of women had shaped the day before it began, where love was pressed into flour and strength whispered through muscle and motion. In the sacred silence of the morning grind, she had learned what it meant to feed not just the stomach, but the spirit of a household. And tomorrow, before the cock crowed again, she would return, hands ready, breath steady, to begin once more. In the heart of a moss-covered village, nestled between green hills and whispering pine trees, the hearth was more than a place to cook. It was the soul of the home, the keeper of warmth, stories, and generations-old memories. At the center of that hearth, blackened by years of fire and fragrant smoke, sat the iron cauldron. It was not new. Sides were dented, its handle thickened with soot. But it was strong, iron-willed, like the women who stirred it, the men who hammered its hook into the stone arch, and the children who clung to its warmth in the biting winter. It had simmered broths for the sick, boiled river trout caught at dawn, brewed herbs picked under the moon, and held together the fabric of family life. This particular day around the cauldron began before the sun even dared peek over the hills. A pale mist still clung to the fields, and dew sparkled on the wooden shingles like frozen tears. Inside the cottage, the air was still and cold. That is, until Melis awoke. Melis was neither old nor young. Her hands bore calluses, and her back sometimes ached, but her eyes still sparkled like she carried a secret. Every morning, she lit the fire beneath the cauldron. She didn't need a rooster to wake her. Her body answered to the rhythm of hunger, duty, and the ticking of a life built on tasks that could not be delayed. Today, as always, she crouched by the hearth, arranging dry birch twigs and curled bark shavings beneath the logs. A spark, the soft whoosh of flame catching breath, and the dance of light began on the stones. The iron cauldron, empty and cold, waited. She poured in well water drawn minutes ago from the stone well just outside. The sound of it echoed slightly against the curved belly of the pot. As steam slowly rose, she added barley soaked overnight, a handful of split peas, and some chopped wild onions kept cool in a root basket. The kitchen filled with the earthy smell of coming nourishment. Outside, the world slowly stirred. A dog barked somewhere near the goat pen. A child yawned, blankets rustled. The day began by mid-morning. The cauldron was bubbling gently, and the room smelled of home. Maylie stirred it with a long-handled wooden ladle carved by her grandfather, now long gone. The ladle creaked softly against the side of the pot, keeping rhythm like a song passed down in the marrow of her bones. Children padded in on bare feet, her two youngest, Jorah and Ellen. Their hair was tousled, cheeks pink from sleep, and they gravitated toward the hearth like moths to flame. "Is it ready?" Jorah asked, eyes wide with hope. "Not yet," Maylie smiled, brushing his hair back. "Good things need time, but I'm hungry now." Ellen pouted, clutching a ragged doll. "Then help me, and it'll be ready sooner." Together, they shelled beans, dropping them into the pot with small plops. Each addition changed the scent now, richer, fuller. Elin fetched herbs Maylie's had hung to dry thyme lovage, and Beyond crumbled them into the cauldron like a spell. By midday, the cauldron had become more than a vessel. It was a bubbling memory in the making. Maylie sat on a small stool beside it, sipping broth with a wooden spoon, checking the seasoning. She hummed an old ballad, and Ellen joined in, off-key but joyful. Outside, her eldest son, Corin, returned from the forest, his boots muddy, arms full of wood, and a pheasant swinging from his belt. His face lit up at the smell that met him at the door. "Smells like last autumn's harvest day," he said, placing the bird gently on the table. "It's meant to," Maylie replied. "We have guests coming." Indeed, they did. Word had traveled. The footpaths of the village. Old Aunt Rail and her son-in-law were visiting from the river valley. They came twice a year, bringing dried fish, gossip, and the thin sweetness of pear cider. Today was one of those days. Rail arrived just before the sun leaned westward, her laughter a familiar cackle like broomsticks brushing stone. She kissed Maylie's on both cheeks, scolded the children lovingly, and sniffed the air. "You still use that cauldron? Haven't let it rest?" Maylie chuckled. "It's the only one who knows all the recipes." Rail ran a hand along the blackened iron. "Reverently, your grandmother stirred this when we were girls. I remember the soup with garlic and stinging nettle during the famine. It fed us when nothing else would. It feeds us still." By late afternoon, the cottage was alive with sound. The hearth glowed. The cauldron steamed with pride. A scent, meat, skinned and cleaned, had been added to the stew. Wild mushrooms from Corin's forage joined the bubbling mass, and the scent became irresistible. Neighbors began arriving with small gifts: a loaf of sour rye, a jug of ale, a basket of cheese wrapped in muslin. No one was formally invited, but the hearth called them, and they answered. Someone brought a fiddle. Another began a song. Ellen and Jorah clapped to the rhythm, while Maylie served bowls of the thick stew, ladling it from the heart of the cauldron. She handed each bowl like a blessing. Old Rail took her first spoonful and sighed. "It's like drinking the memory of warmth." The villagers nodded, chewing slowly, savoring. No one asked what exactly was in the stew. It didn't matter. Each bowl was more than food, was comfort, history, and unspoken understanding. Night came gently. The children, full and drowsy, fell asleep on hay-stuffed cushions. The fiddle played slower tunes. Adults leaned in toward each other, speaking softly. Outside, the mist returned, blanketing the earth in hush. Inside, the cauldron had quieted. A low gurgle remained, like the breath of something living. Its work was done for the day. Maylie sat by it once more, ladle in hand, eyes half closed. She wasn't tired, not really. Her soul was full. Around her, the hearth glowed with a soft light, flickering over the stone walls, the beams, the faces of her family and friends. She thought of her grandmother, who had stirred this same pot in this same place, whose voice once sang the same lullabies. She thought of winters past, of children grown, of days spent around this very circle of warmth. The iron cauldron, humble and heavy, had witnessed it all. The Longhouse of Jarl Sigurd stood sturdy and proud atop a grassy rise, its walls built from timber the color of old ale, and its roof thatched with thick reeds. Smoke drifted lazily from the smoke hole in the center, curling into the crisp morning air of spring. Outside, the lands of his village, nestled between forest and fjord, glittered with dew. The earth had finally shaken off winter's grip. Women walked toward the banks with baskets of fish. Children played along the beaten paths, and oxen pulled carts laden with last year's grain. But inside that longhouse, on a dawn like this, the sweetest magic of Viking cuisine quietly came to life. At the heart of the longhouse, Stred, the Jarl's daughter, knelt beside a massive wooden trough filled with a bubbling golden liquid. Her thick braids swung over her shoulders as she leaned closer, inhaling deeply. The scent rising toward her was rich and wild, sweet honey mingled with crushed birch bark and edges of warm yeast. She stirred the mixture with a carved birch ladle, listening to the murmur of fermentation. Her mead was coming alive again. For generations, Astrid's family had been famed across coastal settlements for their meaded drink of the gods. Aged in oaken casks and sweetened with honey gathered from feral bees in the birch woods. It was not mere drink to them. Mead was liquid sunlight, preserved from summer blooms to warm the darkest winter nights. Hurry, Astrid called her mother, Freydis, from near the hearth. Today is festival day. You know well that guests from Bergfin's tribe will judge us by flavor before hospitality. Astrid nodded. Outside, the birds had broken into songs, and she could already hear the creak of wagon wheels arriving for the spring sweetness feaster tradition meant to honor Freya, goddess of fertility and plenty. At this festival, strength mattered less than delicacy. The men laid down their swords for bowls and flagons, and women boasted not of sons, but of recipes passed down through whispered secrets. Astrid wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the wooden racks where honeycombs glistened. She remembered the summer past when she had ventured with the village boys into the dark woods to hunt wild honey. They carried torches and smoked branches of elder to drive the bees temporarily from their mossy nests wedged in fallen tree trunks. When she cracked open a hive, a river of amber flowed out. Thick and slow as destiny itself, she scooped that honey now into a carved bowl. It caught the light like shards of afternoon. This was the soul of their cuisine, that and the birch. Every part of the birch tree played its role. In meat making, the inner bark was stripped, dried, and ground into a rough spice that added subtle, minty, wintergreen flavors. The outer bark became bowls and waterproof wraps. The sap, tapped in spring, was drunk fresh or boiled down to sweet syrup. Outside, drums began to pound. Astrid heard the low roar of men's laughter floating in. She thought of the secret she had hidden away for this festival, under her bed in a sealed clay jar lined with birch bark. She had aged a special batch of honey infused with rose hips and lingonberries, letting it ferment silently through the winter snow. It tasted like summer love remembered in frost. Now, perhaps she would dare present it to her father and his guests. She hurried to the far corner where bees' wax cakes lay drying. With practiced fingers, she shaved pieces to float across the surface of the mead, creating a thin seal that would protect it until serving. The wax glowed gently in the dim light. Then, quickly drying her hands, she reached for her rough wool cloak and stepped outside. The village green had been transformed. Brightly colored banners, embroidered with animal spores, ravens, and stags fluttered between wooden posts. Girls scattered birch leaves across the ground with laughter. Tables groaned under trays of baked apples filled with honey and berries. There were golden biscuits dusted with birch sap sugar, bowls of thick yogurt drizzled with mead syrup, and wooden plates piled high with honey-glazed salmon. Down by the fjord stood a massive fire pit where racks of goat ribs were being slowly rotated, sizzling as they were brushed with honey birch glaze. The glaze dripped onto the coals, bursting into little flames that danced beneath the meat. It was a sight both fierce and inviting, very much like Viking life itself. Astrid walked among it all, checking every detail with a critical eye until her father's booming voice called across the square. "Astrid, bring forth the mead. Our guests are thirsty, and my throat is as dry as an old raid tail." Villagers laughed. Astrid nodded and beckoned two strong youths to help carry the first cask. As it thudded into place, the men of Bergvin's clan stepped nearer. They were broad men with braided beards, and they bore drinking horns as tall as Astrid's arm. Their leader, covered in a cloak of shaggy white wolf fur, sniffed suspiciously at the air. "What flavor dances here?" he asked, voice rumbling. Like distant thunder, Astrid smiled thinly. "Honey gathered from the wild bees of our northern woods. Birch bark aged in our own smokehouse. In time," she said, "the three become one to honor Freya today." Bergvin's eyes narrowed, impressed despite himself. With a nod, he lifted his horn as Astrid poured. The mead flowed out like molten gold, catching the sunlight. When he tasted it, his stern face relaxed and his eyes softened. "By Thor's beard," he said reverently, "it's sweeter than any southern wine." Cheers erupted. Her father clapped her on the back, grinning broadly. "That is my daughter. What men forge with iron, she forges with bees and bark." Encouraged by success, Astrid moved back toward her house in secret. She fetched the clay jar with trembling fingers. This was her true pride. When she returned, the feast was in full swing. Jugglers tossed birchwood clubs while children licked honey off their fingers. Elderly women traded cooking tips in hushed tones. How long to roast walnuts in birch embers? When the bees' flowers tasted sweetest aught, Astrid lifted a small drinking cup and poured the fermented berry honey mead. It shimmered a pale lilac color, wonderfully unexpected. She brought it first to her mother. Frady sipped and closed her eyes. Tears shimmered in her lashes. "It tastes like last midsummer," she whispered, thinking of flowers in the night and lover songs. She kissed Astrid on the forehead. "Serve it." Astrid did so carefully, offering it only to those who understood subtlety. The reaction was wild. Within moments, whispers spread. Soon, people clamored for a taste of Astrid's summer mead. Even Bergvin, grinning now with honey in his beard, raised his horn for more. "Your village may be small," he declared loudly, "but you guard a sweetness worthy of Asgard itself." The sun rode higher in the sky as music filled every corner. Warriors arm wrestled with sticky hands. Babies drooled honey over their wool tunics. Old men argued whether birch bark should be boiled before drying. In the center of it all, Astrid watched, filled with quiet pride. Sweetness was not weakness here, it was skill, memory, and fierce devotion. As afternoon faded, Astrid stepped away briefly, seeking silence. She walked toward the edge of the birch forest, where slender white trunks rose like pillars of an open-air temple. Here, the bees hummed lazily among delicate flowers. She pressed her palm to the nearest birch tree, feeling its smooth, papery bark. "Thank you," she whispered, for it was this tree that flavored their mead and sugared their pastries. Its sap was thick and delicate. Its inner bark, when ground fine, healed stomach aches. Sleeves were brewed into tea. It was the quiet companion of the Viking cook, subtle yet endlessly useful, when at last twilight painted the sky purple and orange. The villagers lit torches dipped in beeswax. The feast turned softer dreamier. People leaned together, speaking of harvest hopes and children unborn. Mead loosened tongues and knitted hearts, its sweetness threaded through conversations like gold thread in a tapestry. Bergfin's clan, thoroughly softened by Astrid's mead, pledged peaceful trade through the coming year. Men toasted 2 future deals, sealed not with axes but with honey-drenched bread, promising furs, amber, and wool in exchange for more of her magic at the feast's end. Astrid stood beside the final cask, heart full. She realized something then. Though Vikings were known across the world as raiders and warriors, their true legacy might lie here in sweetness cultivated with patience, in flavors remembered long after raids faded, in golden mead sipped slowly, on nights heavy with stars. Later, long after exhausted guests had staggered to their boats, Astrid sat on the Longhouse steps with a cup of her berry-infused mead. She watched the moon rise over the fjord, silvering the water. Her mother joined her, easing down beside her with a tired sigh. "You should gift your best mead to Freya's shrine tomorrow," Freda said softly. "Choreographed is more than food or drink, it's blessing." Astrid smiled, pressing the cup to her lips. The mead tasted of summer berries, wild honey, and faint spice from birch bark. It tasted of patience and pride. "Yes," she whispered, "we will honor the goddess. And next year I will brew even better." Her mother chuckled, spoken like a true keeper of sweetness. Until the night wrapped itself around them gently, scented with beeswax and birchwood smoke, far from the clang of swords and shields, in a quiet village alive with joy. The sweetness of Viking cuisine lived on, not just in jars of honey or casks of mead, but in hearts full of tradition and hands skilled at turning nature into something divine. Even when summer turned again to winter and frost rhymed the world in ice, they would gather around firelight and pour from those golden barrels. They would close their eyes and taste sunlight, berries, and bark, remembering that in every fierce Viking soul burned a love for sweetness, just as fierce and just as enduring. The sun had barely lifted its golden rim over the far-off hills when the quiet valley stirred awake. A thin net of mist hung between the trees like a secret waiting to dissolve. Vi, in an old mud-plastered house with a thatched straw roof, nestled at the base of a rocky ridge, lived a woman named Illyra. She was neither old nor young. Her face held a soft, timeless calm, with eyes that reflected years of WATCH FULNESS. Every morning before the first rooster crowed, Lyra rose silently from her straw-filled mattress, wrapped her shoulders with a faded woolen shawl, and stepped out into the crisp hush of the dawn. Outside her little home, a pair of flat stones lay beside a circle of rounded river rocks, blackened from decades of smoke. These stones were smooth and gray, warmed by countless fires and weathered by countless stories. Here, Illyra practiced a ritual that had been passed down from her mother, Kay, and her mother before her, the ritual of bread baking on flat stones. Inside her dim kitchen, a clay jar of wheat berries sat waiting on a low wooden shelf. Illyra poured a handful into a hollowed-out stone mortar. She picked up a weather-singed wooden pestle and began to grind. Round and round, her arms moved, slow and rhythmic, stone against stone, grain against grain. The air began to fill with the earthy scent of crushed wheat. She worked without hurry or force, letting the weight of the pestle do the labor, letting muscle and memory guide each turn. It was a dance between rock and grain, bone and breath. As each batch turned to coarse flour, she sifted it into a wide terracotta bowl. When she had enough, she added a pinch of salt, scooped water from a copper pail, and poured it in a thin stream, stirring gently with her hand until the ingredients hugged together. In just a few minutes, a dough of beige color and soft texture took shape beneath her fingers. Outside, golden sunlight was beginning to creep quietly across the stone hearth. Birds chirped in the distant alder trees, and somewhere nearby, a sleepy goat bleated. Illyra knelt on a flat log beside the hearth, and, using a bundle of dried twigs, lit a small fire under the large, flat stones. She fed the flames with thin branches of juniper and pine until flickering tongues of fire licked the underbellies of the stones. Soon, heat bled upward, turning their gray surfaces into glowing ovens. While the fire crackled, Illyra pinched off small balls of dough, rolling them between her palms into perfect spheres. Then, on a smooth wooden board dusted lightly with flour, she pressed each ball flat, turning it gently to create circles of even thinness. Each disc was pale and soft, speckled with tiny, golden pieces of husk. These were not the fluffy loaves of market towns or the buttery rolls of noble kitchens. These flatbreads were simple, as ancient as the very stones on which they baked, yet to Illyra, they were sacred. With care, she placed each circle directly onto the hot flat stones. In seconds, they sizzled, releasing wisps of steam as the dough began to cook. Its faint bubbles swelled across their surfaces, the edges crisped into a smoky bronze. The smell drifting upward was the smell of earth and hearth, humble and soul-filling. She flipped each flatbread with her bare fingers, fingers toughened by years of labor, but still tender enough to feel when the bread was just right. As she did so, she hummed a quiet tune, an old lullaby once sung to her by her mother while kneading dough much the same way. Soon, a stack of golden brown breads formed in a woven basket beside her, covered lightly with a cotton cloth to keep them warm and soft by the time the sun had climbed fully, washing the valley in mellow light. A dozen breads lay ready. The fire had calmed to glowing embers. Illyra sat back on her heels, wiped her brow with her sleeve, and allowed herself a small smile. She dipped the edge of a still steaming flatbread into a bowl of crushed olives, and tasted the fruit of her morning's effort. Salty, smoky, warm, and rooted in generations of memory. This quiet ritual was more than sustenance. It was remembrance. Illyra's mother had baked bread on these very stones, and her grandmother before that. She recalled childhood mornings when she had tiptoed out of bed to watch her mother's hands, smooth and graceful then, practicing the same motions. She remembered how her tiny feet had felt cold against the packed earth floor, and how huge and magical the stones had seemed then. Those moments had smelled of burning pine and fresh dough. Nothing in the world ever felt more secure. As years passed, life had shifted like wind-blown dust. There had been seasons of scarcity when grain was measured by pity. There had been seasons of plenty when neighbors helped neighbors harvest wheat from the terraced fields, singing as they cut tall stalks under the summer sun. Yet, no matter what came, the ritual of bread baking remained unchanged. Even during the bitter winter, when her father fell ill and never rose again, her mother had set her jaw and lit the fire beneath the stones. Because she had whispered to young Illyra, "We cannot stop doing what keeps our hearts beating." Now Illyra whispered the same to herself. Village children sometimes wandered down the hillside, drawn by the scent and the warmth. Illyra always offered them a piece. They giggled as they chewed, crumbs sticking to their cheeks. "Why do you use stones, Aunt Illyra?" one girl asked one day, her voice bright as a silver bell. Illyra's eyes filled with a soft shine. "'Cause," she told the children, "stones remember. They remember our mothers and our grandmothers, our stories and our joys. Each time I bake bread, the stones remind me I belong." The children blinked, puzzled but charmed, and ran off laughing. Illyra watched them go, clutching her shawl close against a passing breeze. One afternoon, olive green shadows stretched long across the valley. A peddler came trudging along the road, a man with dust-crusty boots and a sack of bright tinware slung on his back. He stopped outside Illyria's gate to rest. She invited him into her yard and shared a piece of bread, still warm. The man closed his eyes, savoring each bite. "What flour mill makes this bread?" he asked. Illyria smiled. "No mill," she answered softly. "Only hands, stones, and the patience of dawn." The man shook his head with wonder. "In all my travels," he said, "I have never tasted bread so honest." He offered her a shiny tin pan as payment, but Illyria gently refused. "Your kind words are enough," she said. Days spilled into weeks. Seasons passed in gold, then russet, then white. In winter, Illyria chipped ice from the well to mix with flour. She baked bread with trembling fingers while snowflakes floated down on her shawl. In spring, wild herbs sprouted between the stones, and she sometimes added leaves of thyme or mint into her dough for a freshness that made children grin. In summer, the sun made the stones so hot by mid-morning that she had to wake before even the first stars faded to finish baking. And in autumn, wheat was harvested again, plump and golden, promising another year of bread and memory. With each passing year, Illyria's hair turned a little more silver, but her hands never forgot the rhythm of grinding, mixing, shaping, baking. To strangers, she might have looked like any other village woman. But those who tasted her bread felt something else, something tender, ancient, and comforting, as if the stones themselves had offered warmth to their bellies and peace to their peace, to their souls. One spring morning, as dew still clung to every blade of grass, Illyria's neighbor, a younger woman named Mary, knocked on her door. In her arms, she carried a bundle wrapped in cloth. Illyria opened the door with her usual quiet smile. "Teach me," Mary blurted, eyes bright with eagerness. "Teach me to bake bread like you, with stones, with song, with heart." A deep warmth glowed in Illyria's chest. She stepped aside, motioning her neighbor in. Together, they mixed flour, ground wheat, whispered stories, and hummed old lullabies. Mary's laughter rang beside the fire. She winced as she brushed her fingers against the hot stones, but still she learned. And when the first flatbread puffed proudly on the stone's heated surface, Mary gasped in delight. Illyria placed it gently in Mary's palms. "Bread," she said softly, "is less about feeding the body than it is about feeding the spirit." From then on, Mary returned morning after morning, and other village women soon followed. Illyria never refused anyone. The stone hearth became a place of gathering, where women shared not only bread, but stories of childhood, worries of crops, hopes for their children, and sweetness of small joys. The crackle of fire and the sizzle of dough mingled with laughter and tears, healing things that words could not reach. Over time, Illyria's humble ritual wove itself into the rhythms of the community. Children carried memories of smoky, warm bread throughout their lives. Travelers passing through stopped on purpose to taste the stone-baked magic. Slowly, gently, Illyria realized that her role had changed. She was no longer merely baking bread, She was giving people a piece of belonging, a fragment of ancient wisdom reminding them that life, even with its hardships, could be beautiful when shared. Years later, when Illyria was too old to knead for long, Mary and others took over the morning duties. But every dawn, Illyria would wrap herself in her threadbare shawl and hobble outside to sit beside the hearth. She would close her eyes, breathing in the smell of dough, smoke, and stones, just as she had done since childhood. When someone placed a hot flatbread in her hand, and when she took that first slow bite, she felt her heart whisper, "Yes, I am still here." And so the ritual continued, quiet, ancient, glowing like the embers under the flat stones, melting into the heartbeat of the valley. Even after Illyria passed away, the stones remained. Her name was spoken with reverence in every household that shared the bread. Break the flatbread softly, mothers told their children, for this is how we honor those who came before us. Generation followed generation. And, though the world outside the valley changed, metal ovens replaced clay hearths in some homes. Flour arrived in sacks instead of from grinding stones. Still, on a certain patch of land, warmed by the sun and watched over by cedar and sparrow, two flat stones continued to glow each dawn, waiting for gentle hands to shape dough and lay it down, whispering old lullabies. For this bread was not only food. It was history. It was comfort. It was love, pressed gently between palm and stone. It was the quiet ritual that reminded everyone who tasted it that the simplest things, wheat, water, salt, fire, and patient hands, could be transformed into something timeless, something holy. A sharp wind howled across the misty coastline, carrying with it the temps of sea salt and the faintest echo of gull cries. In a small Viking settlement pressed between brooding fjords and dark pine forests, stories whispered that hidden in those ancient woods, beneath moss-covered stones and beside black pools untouched by light, there grew plants powerful enough to heal wounds, break fevers, and even call back wandering spirits. Freydis Avensdotter, barely past 16, had heard such tales all her life, but she'd never believed them until her younger brother, Ivar, fell sick the day after a storm-tossed trading vessel limped into the harbor. First came a fever so strong it turned his skin crimson, then chills so savage his teeth clattered like a smith's hammer. The village healer, old Hor, tried everything he knew: honey-sweetened mead, smoked fish broth, crushed yarrow leaves packed at his pulse points, but Ivar only worsened. Eyes sunken, breath ragged. Pray to the gods, Roar told Freydis, stroking his long white beard. Brows knotted, and light a candle for Odin. If the Allfather wishes to take him, there is nothing we mortals can do. Freydis refused to accept that. She would not watch her brother slip away like so many others, taken by this sickness unknown, swift and merciless. She thought of her mother's stories, told when Freydis was young and snuggled by the hearth, tales of shadowy women who gathered rare herbs in secret, far from the prying eyes of men healers whose knowledge had been passed not through books or runestones, but whispers, practiced hands, and moonlight rituals. There was one name in particular, Adis Holdrakona, known as the Hidden Woman, once healer to long-dead Jarls and Seekings. They said she had vanished decades ago after she refused to give a powerful chieftain her medicinal secrets. Some claimed she'd been taken by holders. Others swore they saw her spirit wandering among blackthorns, still plucking herbs in her cloak of crow feathers. One midnight, Freydis rose from her brother's bedside, the fire burning low, and stepped into the chill under a crescent moon. Beneath her woolen shawl, she clutched a single drinking horn of warmed mead. She marched beyond the village palisade, heart pounding in her chest as she entered the forest, guided by memory, rumor, and desperation. After hours of searching paths, twisted with roots and dripping ferns, she came upon a clearing woven with vines of creeping ivy. At its far edge stood a hut so ancient that trees had grown around and through it, as if nature herself tried to reclaim it. The door creaked as Freydis pushed it open. Inside smelled of damp earth and wild herbs. Bundles dangled from the ceiling, dried nettle, feverfew, marshmallow root, and a stone hearth sat cold, choked in ash. She stepped cautiously, breaths visible in the frigid air. "You're far from the warmth of your hearth, girl." Freydis spun around. From the darkest corner emerged a figure draped in black wool, her hair white as new snow, her eyes sharp, gleaming like polished jet. Though bent with age, she carried herself like a hawk watching a mouse at his Holdrakona. Freydis whispered, The woman said nothing, but the slightest twitch of her mouth hinted at a smile. My brother is dying, Frades pleaded. No one can heal him. I will do anything you ask. Cut my hair, swear blood oath, gather herbs, until my fingers are raw just to save him. Cadus walked slowly, bone-carved staff tapping the wooden floor. To heal is to know life and death. Are you ready to carry both in your heart? Yes, Frades answered without hesitation. Then learn quickly, for each breath your brother takes may be his last. Over the next hours, Hades taught her what few had ever dared speak aloud. She spoke of shadow herbs, plants that thrived only in places sunlight kissed briefly or not at all, under fallen tree trunks, beside graves, in forgotten ravines. These were not for the faint of heart. Some could heal fevers, mend flesh, or quiet coughs, but others would stop the breath forever if misused. The trick? Cadus rasped. Fingers, like twisted roots selecting a bundle, is imbalance. Too much wild rosemary and fever dips too fast heart cannot bear. Too little wintergreen and bones ache till they crack. You must listen to the plant's spirit. It speaks. Frades swallowed hard, nodding. They set out again before dawn. Frades held a woven basket, while Hades led her to hidden spots only. A lifetime of memory could recall first, under a half-rotted oak trunk tangled in mushrooms. They plucked Galviral's silver-veined leaves, said to draw infection from the blood. Next came Marbegrat, the night root, a pale tuber that glowed faintly in the dark and, when sliced thin, eased burning fevers. Lastly, they gathered Grimvir's moss, used to protect the heart and lungs, though its bitter taste could make men retch for hours. By noon, they returned to the hut. Hades showed her how to grind the herbs, using a stone carved with runes. Mixing them with a spoonful of raw honey and a splash of vinegar distilled from old mead. The resulting paste smelled sharp and metallic. This you must carry home in your mouth, Hades instructed, surprising her. Your warmth awakens it, binds it with your will. Only then will it work for your blood. Frades hesitated, but scooped a dollop onto her tongue. It stung like ice and fire at once. You won't come with me? These roots lie in shadows, for a reason, Hades said. If I step into your world, elders will cry witchcraft, burn my hut, and forget your brother ever lived. You must carry the healing. Outside, light snow drifted. Frades clutched a pouch of remaining herbs under her cloak and ran back toward the village. By the time she reached their longhouse, Ivor's breaths were shallow. Hor sat nearby, eyes sad. Where have you? She brushed past him, knelt, and forced the pungent paste between Ivor's cracked lips. He groaned, but she held his jaw gently, whispering a prayer not to Odin or Thor, but to the nameless spirits of dark roots and hidden waters. Hours passed. Wrong grumbled useless warnings of poison and curses, but Frades sat firm, cooling. Ivor's brow. At dusk, his breathing steadied. By dawn, the fever broke. His eyes opened wide in confusion. Sister, Frades laughed, tears spilling down her cheeks. You're staying in this world, she said, brushing his damp hair back. We still have fish to catch and mischief to make. Word of the miracle spread like wildfire. Villagers asked what healer performed such magic, but Frades claimed only that she followed old ways once passed among our foremothers. Hor narrowed his eyes, sensing more, but he said nothing, perhaps out of shame that his own remedies had failed that winter. More mysterious ailments spread: bloody coughs, infected wounds from sea raids, strange swellings. At the time, Frades slipped back to the hut, learning new recipes from Hades. Troll call stems mixed with goose fat, 2 sealed sword cuts. Skugglblom petals steeped into purple tea to stop internal bleeding. Bone flour, burned and inhaled to quiet coughing at night. You're becoming a shadow child, Hades one day remarked as they crushed dried garlic against raven's feather. Your hand steady, your heart fierce. Frades beamed with pride, but also noticed Ada's limbs trembling more these days, her breath wheezing after each long trek. "Let me care for you too," she said. Ada cursed under her breath. "When bones turn to dust, no herb can turn them young again," she muttered, turning away. Spring arrived, thawing the ground. Ivor returned to fishing, healthy and full of mischief again. Villages nearby began sending quiet messengers, seeking Freddie's help. She mixed remedies in secret by firelight and slipped packets into baskets under the cover of night. Some she healed, others slipped away. Not even the most powerful herbs could always wrest life from the jaws of death. One evening, she arrived at the hut with baskets of new linen and fish for Ada, but found it silent. The door creaked open easily. The bundles still hung, but dust coated the hearth. Ada was gone. On the wooden table lay a single crow feather in a small leather-bound pouch. Inside were scraps of bark etched with runes herbler enough to last a lifetime. Fredes pressed it to her chest, eyes damp. A final gift. She buried the feather and pouch in a wooden box under her bed back home, whispering, "I'll continue your work." Years rolled on. Fredes became a woman known far and wide as healer, midwife, charm maker. But though many sought her remedies, few knew her secret, that in the darkest shadow of Viking medicine lay powers, not sung by skalds or carved in stone. Powers born of hidden women who passed their secrets not in halls of war, but in silent forests, under moonlit skies. And sometimes, when Fredes gathered herbs beneath the waxy leaves of nightroot or clipped oil-rich stems of trollcall, she felt the briefest brush of wings at her cheek like a crow in flight tour, heard the rustle of skirts just beyond sight. Perhaps it was the wind, or perhaps Ida's whole Dracona still watched from the shadows, proud that her knowledge lived not on mighty runestones, but in the quiet hands of a girl who had once dared to walk into the unknown to save someone she loved. Thus endured the forgotten Viking medicinal recipes, not spoken aloud at feasts, not etched on rune staffs, but wandering with the women who knew that true power lay not in sword or shield, but in roots, leaves, and the enduring will to heal. The sun had barely crested over the fjord when Astrid stirred from her straw mattress. The chill of the morning air wrapped around her shoulders like a rough wool cloak as she sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Around her, the Longhouse was quiet, save for the occasional snort from one of the goats housed inside for warmth during the lingering spring frost, as Frid, just 16, was not yet a woman in the eyes of the elders, but in the Viking kitchen she had already earned her place. Today, like every other day, she would prepare the morning porridge with the wooden spoon her grandmother had carved and oiled with whale blubber to keep it from splintering. That spoon, darkened with years of broth and stew, was more than a utensil, it was a legacy. She tiptoed past her sleeping younger brother, careful not to wake him, and reached for the heavy iron pot hanging from the center beam of the Longhouse hearth. The fire had gone low in the night, but glowing embers still throbbed at the heart of the ashes. She took a bundle of dried seaweed and birch bark from the basket and breathed softly as the flames returned to life. The crackle was as familiar as her own heartbeat. The Viking kitchen was not a separate room. It was the heart of the home. Smoke clung to the thatch above and drifted in soft currents across the rafters. Fat rendered from seals, whales, and boars hung in clay pots and animal stomachs along the walls. Their smells mingled with wood smoke, the sourness of fermenting fish, and the tang of salt, creating a scent that no visitor ever forgot from the larder. Astrid took a sack of barley grains, soaking them in seawater the night before. She poured them into the pot and added a pinch of dried berries gathered from the inland thickets. then stirred with a wooden spoon, making a slow, steady figure eight. Her grandmother had always said, "A good cook never rushes the morning porridge. It teaches patience before battle and love before hardship." Soon, the others began to stir. Her mother came first, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders and nodding approvingly at the simmering pot. "Leave a bit for the gods," she reminded, motioning toward the small bowl set near the door. "And not just for the Allfather. Prayer favors those who feed the land." Asfred nodded and laid on the small scoop into the offering bowl before returning to her work. Her father entered next, his boots caked in dried kelp from the shore. "The tide brought in a big catch," he said, setting down a basket of flapping fish. "And one of the men spotted a whale near the headland. For lucky, it'll strand itself." A beached whale meant more than meat. It meant oil thick, yellow-white, and strong-smelling. The oil could be used for lamps, trade, and cooking. Asfred recalled how, last winter, a small whale had washed ashore, and her mother rendered the fat in a wide copper pan over a roaring fire. The oil had splattered and hissed, and the stench had driven her siblings outside, but the result had been worth it. Whale oil kept the kitchen burning through the darkest months. Later that morning, the hearth roared with life as Asfred helped her mother prepare stew for the day's meal. They used every part of the fish head, bones, eyes, and all simmering them with herbs from the kitchen garden and thickening the broth with seaweed paste. Over the stew, she drizzled a spoonful of preserved whale oil. It added not only fat and warmth, but also a taste of the sea deep, rich, and oddly comforting. They cooked in clay pots, blackened by years of fire, and stirred with wooden spoons made from driftwood and birch. Every tool had a purpose: the flat paddle for turning oatcakes, the long-handled ladle for drawing broth, the notched spoon for separating curds from whey. These weren't mass-made things. They were shaped by hand, seasoned with smoke, and passed down through generations. Outside, her older cousin, Gunvor, arrived carrying a bundle of wild garlic and tender greens. She was fresh from the nearby meadow, and her cheeks were pink from the wind. "These will sweeten the stew," she said, tossing the greens onto the stone slab beside the hearth. "And there's honeycomb from the old stump near the river. I took just enough not to anger the bees." Asfred grinned. "You risk stings for sweetness." Gunvor laughed, brushing soot from her skirt. "Better than risking father's temper for bland stew." As the women worked, Asfred's younger brother woke and came stumbling to the hearth, rubbing his eyes. She handed him a warm bowl of porridge and ruffled his hair. "Eat before it cools," she said. "Okay, and take some to the old man outside. His joints are stiff this morning." The old man Herjolf wasn't really related to them. Had once been a warrior, now too bent with age to row or hunt. But he told stories tales of kitchens aboard longships, where cooking was done on small, portable hearths, and spoons were made quickly from whalebone when wood was scarce. He claimed to have eaten whale tongue roasted over sea coals, and once boiled seal blubber with kelp in a storm. Some thought he lied. Asfred believed every word. That afternoon, as the stew boiled and the flatbread cooked on the stones, Herjolf came in and sat by the fire. His beard was white as gold feathers, and his fingers trembled, but his eyes gleamed with memory. "I once saw a woman win a chieftain's heart with just her stew," he said, gesturing toward the pot. "She had nothing but barley, whale oil, and wild herbs, but she cooked it slow, poured it over smoked fish, fed the man like a king. He gave her 3 goats and married her a week later." Gunvor rolled her eyes. "Did she stay married?" "430 winters," Herjolf said. Then she hit him with the stew pot. Laughter rippled through the kitchen. Even Asfred's mother smiled as she added a splash of honey to the simmering brew. When evening came, the Longhouse filled with family, neighbors, and noise. Children tumbled across the straw-strewn floor. Men returned from the shore, bringing stories, and salted cod. Everyone gathered around the hearth, where bowls of hot stew, bread, smoked fish were passed hand to hand. The light came not from torches, but from stone lamps filled with whale oil, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air shimmered with warmth, scent, and sound. Asfred sat beside the hearth, stirring the pot for the last time that day. The wooden spoon, now worn and glossy, moved with the grace of memory. She thought of her grandmother's hands, of her own mother's voice, of Herjolf's tales, of the kitchen tools, the spoons, the stones, the pots, the oil that built their lives, not with weapons or warriors, but with food, fire, and care. She whispered a small prayer to the gods, not for glory or gold, but for another day of warmth, of shared meals, and of the simple, quiet power of the Viking kitchen. The iron cauldron simmered long before dawn, hanging on a soot-blackened hook above the hearth. In the half-lit kitchen of Jarlhold's Longhouse, where smoke curled thick and languid beneath the rafters, Skiva, the thrall, awoke before even the rooster's cry. At 16, she'd already spent nearly half her life in the service of the household. Her fate sealed the day her village on the eastern coast was raided, and she, like a dozen others, was chained, branded, and sold as a slave in the bustling Viking market of Kopang. Yet, in this warm, ever-humming kitchen, she had carved out her existence. Her hands familiar with every tool, the bone-handled ladle, the stone-grinding corn, the ash-baked clay pots. A thrall might sleep on a straw mattress thin as parchment and eat from wooden bowls scarred with years of use, but the kitchen was her kingdom. Small though it was, bound by smoke, spices, and orders she could never refuse. Outside, the wind howled across the fjord and beat against the Longhouse walls. Winter was stubborn, fierce, and endless in the northern lands, but the Jarl's household still expected comforts, warm breads, thick stews, and mead, spiced just so. Sigrid wrapped her coarse wool shawl tighter, slipped on wooden clogs, and crouched to stoke the dying embers. Sparks leaped, burst, then softened. Fire was precious here, not just for cooking, but for life itself. Her tasks began with bread. Barley grain, stored in the pantry chest, had to be ground down, handful by handful, between the ridged basalt stones. The corn was heavy, each rotation demanding strength. As she circled the top stone, she hummed a low tune once sung by her mother. If she sang softly, no one would hear, and she could resurrect a fragment of who she once was. By the end of an hour, fine flour dust clung to her arms and lashes, but the work was only just beginning. She mixed cold water and flour in a wooden trough, kneaded until her fingers ached, then slapped rough discs of dough onto hot, flat stones arranged carefully at the hearth's edge while bread baked. She tended the meat stew bubbling in the cauldron yesterdays, leftovers of goat offal, onion, and cabbage leaves rescued from the brink of rot. A thrall's art was in turning scraps into something the household could praise. Lest the mistress lash out for wasting even a bone, she added thin shavings of dried herbs, mugwort, lovage, mustard seed, precious imports, designating the prestige of our master's trade routes. Though Sigvar could barely pronounce their names, she valued them more than jewelry. Jarlhold's wife, Lady Asfred, entered without warning. Her silk-trimmed kirtle whispered power with every step. Sigvar bowed her head low, hands behind her back in submission. "Is the bread ready?" the lady demanded, eyeing the simmering pot with mistrust. "Yes, mistress," Sigrid answered quickly. Her voice was soft but steady. She had learned the delicate balance, appear obedient but not sniveling, capable but never proud. Lady Asfred lifted a flat bread with her jeweled tongs, sniffed. "You will prepare a feast tonight. My husband entertains 3 traders from across the sea." We must show our wealth. Without another glance at Sigvor, she swept from the room, trailing the scent of imported lavender. Sigvor exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd held. A feast that meant more cooking than ever. Roasted pork, honey-glazed turnips, smoked herring, butter churned fresh. She would need help. The younger thrall boy, Ivor, barely 12, would assist in fetching wood, hauling water, and plucking the birds for roasting. Despite his youth, the boy's back was already bowed from years of carrying heavy pails from the shoreline spring. By noon, Skeever had sent Ivor scurrying thrice to the cellars. Meanwhile, she herself wielded knives to gut fish, chopped roots, and stirred until her shoulders burned. Kitchen thralls rarely paused. Each moment wasted risked their position, or worse, their lives. She still remembered the old thrall diary, who fainted from exhaustion last summer and spilled mead on a guest's embroidered sleeve. Stripped of her smock and dignity, Thyri was sold to a coastal salt mine by sunset. No one ever heard from her again. No mistakes, Sigvor whispered to herself, eyes sharp with memory. She poured precious honey from a clay jar into a pot over low flame, watching it bubble slowly into golden syrup. The scent lifted into the rafters and mixed with the constant churn of wood smoke, creating a haze that left Sigvor's head light by late afternoon. Geese crackled on spits, fat dripping and spitting into the fire. Bread loaves were piled high, each brushed with sour melted butter. She sliced fresh apples, arranged them with nuts and fragmented cheese from last summer's wheel. Each platter became a piece of art, designed not for beauty alone, but for the Jarl's prestige. A tease, because the worth of a Viking household was measured in feasts and finery as much as swords and ships outside the kitchen door. Guests began to arrive. Sigvor heard male laughter, the clink of metal clasps being undone, the shuffle of boots on packed earth floors. Her heartbeat quickened. This was when accidents happened, when pace and pressure grew unbearable. Together with Ivar, she carried platters into the hall. As she entered the dining space, the world transformed. Gold-studded shields hung like trophies. Tapestries boasted scenes of serpent-prowed longships slicing across foreign seas. The Jarl himself sat at the high seat, his silver-streaked beard braided tight. Flickering torchlight painted his face with shadows as he nodded at Sigvor to proceed. Beside him, Lady Astrid looked over with hot, sharp eyes, ever watchful. Sigvor moved silently, laying out cuts of meat, steaming bowls of vegetables, and horn cups filled with meat. The guests, bearded traders, draped in foreign cloaks and thick gold necklaces, scarcely glanced at her. To them, she was invisible, a body, moving food, a vessel rather than a person. That secrecy, that invisibility, was sometimes her only shield. If they did look, it meant danger, a pinch, a crude command, a beck and summoning to their bed pallet. Better to remain unseen. Throughout the feast, she returned to the kitchen at a run, checking on roasts, lifting lids, tasting broths with rapid tongue touches. Sweat collected at her temples. She couldn't hope for water until the last dish. Thirst and hunger mattered little. Only completion did. At last, near midnight, the guests leaned back, bellies round, boasting loud tales, how they crossed storm-lashed seas, how they outtraded rivals in the east, how Hrold offered hospitality of the finest sort. Sigvor stood in the corner of the kitchen doorway, back ramrod straight, waiting. If Lady Astrid decided a course was missing, Sigvor could still be punished, but unexpectedly, the Jarl himself caught her gaze. For a second, she froze, terror rising fast. Then he raised his drinking horn and said loudly, "The food honored, our steeds and our ancestors alike. My kitchen servant has served well." Lady Astrid sniffed, but did not contradict him. Pride flushed Sigvor's cheeks, swift, dangerous. She bowed sharply, head lowered. Thralls were not praised, they were tools. Still, that single sentence would stay with her, powering her body through many weary dawns. After the guests were gone and the roaring laughter dissolved into snoring from the sleeping chambers, Sigvar and Ivar set about their last, most taxing task, cleaning. Wooden boards smeared with grease, platters emptied of bone and rind, spilled mead, sticky underfoot tall, to be scrubbed, rinsed, stacked. There was no rest until the kitchen gleamed again. Only when the hearth burned down to glowing cores of ember did Sigvar allow herself to sit. Exhaustion weighted every inch of her frame. She sipped cold broth from a spoon. This, her first real taste of the feast, though she had cooked it for hours. The silence of the Longhouse felt sacred. Outside, dawn's first hint pinked the sky, faint behind frost-covered slats, as she lay on her straw mattress in the corner. Folding her thin blanket over her aching body, Sigvar stared at the wooden ceiling. A thrall's life was harsh without freedoms, without certainty. She could be sold tomorrow to another household, or die in childbirth like many women of her lot. She did not dream grand dreams. Yet within the world she was given, she found small threads of strength in her craft, in her endurance, in her name, which only she whispered to herself in the quiet hours. She was not free, but she was not broken. And tomorrow, long before the sun rose, she would rise again. The fire would need stoking, the barley grinding, the bread shaping. She would once more take up her place by the hearth, her hands moving with practiced precision, feeding warriors and traders, warming the hall with unseen labor. She was Siggar, the thrall of the kitchen, and, though the world might never know her story, the Longhouse of Jarl hold pulsed with life because of her.